It took one moment of courage to risk the best friendship she'd ever had, but some truths are too powerful to keep buried. The clock on my desk showed 11:47 p.m., and I was still staring at the same paragraph I'd been trying to write for the past 2 hours. My laptop screen felt like it was burning my eyes, but I couldn't stop. This research paper was due in 3 days, and I was nowhere near finished. Coffee cups scattered around my desk told the story of my desperation. Empty pizza boxes reminded me that I'd been living on junk food for weeks. My small apartment felt quieter than usual tonight. My roommate had left for work earlier that evening, and I knew she wouldn't be back until late. We'd been sharing this place for almost 2 years now, and I'd gotten used to her schedule. She worked as a nurse at the city hospital, pulling long shifts that often stretched into the night. Sometimes I worried about her driving home so tired, but she was tough. Tougher than me, anyway. The apartment we shared wasn't much to look at. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, a kitchen that barely fit 2 people, and a living room where we'd spent countless evenings watching movies and talking about everything and nothing. The rent was cheap, which was all either of us could afford on our student and hospital worker budgets. But it had become home in a way I never expected. I rubbed my eyes and tried to focus on my computer screen again. The words seemed to swim around, making no sense. My brain felt like mush. I'd been pushing myself too hard lately, trying to finish my graduate degree while working part-time at a local bookstore. Sleep had become a luxury I couldn't afford. Every day felt like a race against time, and I was losing badly. The stress was getting to me in ways I didn't want to admit. My shoulders ached constantly from hunching over books and computers. My back hurt from the cheap desk chair I'd bought at a thrift store. Sometimes I caught myself grinding my teeth at night, waking up with a sore jaw. The pressure of finishing school, finding a real job, and figuring out what I wanted to do with my life felt overwhelming. Living with my roommate had been one of the few bright spots in this chaos. We'd known each other since college, back when life seemed simpler and the future felt full of possibilities instead of deadlines. She had this way of making me laugh even on my worst days. When I was stressed about school, she'd show up with my favorite takeout food. When she had rough days at the hospital, I'd listen to her stories about difficult patients and demanding doctors. But lately, things had felt different between us. There was a tension in the air that I couldn't quite name. She'd been quieter than usual, coming home from work and going straight to her room. Our usual movie nights had become rare. The easy conversation we'd always shared felt forced sometimes, like we were both holding back things we wanted to say but couldn't find the words for. I knew she'd been having problems with her boyfriend. They'd been together for over 3 years, and from what I could tell, things weren't going well. I'd hear them arguing on the phone sometimes, her voice getting frustrated and tired. She never talked to me about it directly, but I could see the stress in her face. The way she'd stare at her phone, waiting for messages that either didn't come or said the wrong things. Part of me wanted to ask her what was wrong, to offer the same kind of support she'd always given me. But there was something complicated about the whole situation that I couldn't admit, even to myself. Watching her struggle with her relationship made me feel things I wasn't supposed to feel. Things that weren't appropriate for a friend to feel. The truth was, I'd been attracted to her since we were in college, but she'd always been with someone else, and I'd learned to push those feelings down, to focus on being the best friend I could be instead of wanting something more. It seemed selfish to hope for her relationship to end just because I had feelings she didn't know about. Tonight felt particularly heavy. I'd heard her on the phone earlier, before she left for work, and her voice had sounded different. Defeated, maybe, like she was finally admitting something to herself that she'd been avoiding for a long time. When she left for her shift, she'd barely said goodbye, just grabbed her keys and walked out without her usual smile. I tried to get back to my paper, but my mind kept wandering. The apartment felt too quiet without her presence. Even when we weren't talking, knowing she was there made the place feel alive. Her laugh echoing from the kitchen while she cooked. The sound of her favorite shows playing in her room. The way she'd hum while getting ready for work. The silence tonight was different. It felt like something was building, like the calm before a storm. I couldn't shake the feeling that when she came home tonight, something would be different. Maybe. It was just my exhaustion making me imagine things, but the air itself seemed to be holding its breath. I glanced at the clock again. Almost midnight. She usually got home around this time on weeknights, sometimes later if the hospital was busy. I found myself listening for the sound of her key in the lock, the way I always did without really thinking about it. It had become such a normal part of my routine that I barely noticed I was doing it anymore. But tonight, that familiar sound would change everything. The sound of keys jingling in the hallway made me look up from my laptop. I heard the front door open and close, followed by the familiar sound of her work bag hitting the floor. But something was different tonight. Usually she'd call out a tired hey or ask if I was still awake. Tonight there was only silence. I saved my document and listened carefully. Her footsteps moved through the living room, but they were slower than usual. Heavier somehow, like each step took extra effort. I could hear her moving around in the kitchen, probably getting a glass of water like she always did after work. The refrigerator door opened and closed. Then more silence. Minutes passed. I went back to my paper, trying to focus on the words that still weren't making sense. My brain felt foggy from too much caffeine and not enough sleep. I was just starting to get lost in a particularly confusing paragraph when I heard footsteps in the hallway again. They stopped right outside my bedroom door. I waited, thinking she might knock and ask how my day went or maybe complain about a difficult patient like she sometimes did. But the knock never came. Instead, my door handle turned slowly and the door opened without any warning. She stood in my doorway and immediately I could tell something was very wrong. Her usually bright eyes looked tired and red, like she'd been crying. Her hair was messier than normal, falling around her face in a way that made her look vulnerable and young. She still wore her scrubs from work, but they looked wrinkled and worn like the day had been harder than most. "Hey," I said softly, closing my laptop. "Are you okay?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stepped into my room and closed the door behind her. The click of the door latch sounded unusually loud in the quiet apartment. She leaned against the door for a moment, like she needed it for support. "I need to tell you something," she said, and her voice sounded different, shaky but determined, like she'd been practicing these words during her drive home. I turned my desk chair to face her completely, giving her my full attention. "What's wrong? Did something happen at work?" She shook her head and took a deep breath. "No, it's not about work, it's about everything else." The way she said it made my stomach tighten. There was something in her tone that I'd never heard before, something that made the air in the room feel thick and heavy. She pushed herself away from the door and took a few steps toward my bed. "I broke up with him," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out like she couldn't hold them back anymore. "Tonight, before my shift. I called him and ended it." I felt my heart do something complicated in my chest. Relief mixed with concern, mixed with something I couldn't name. "Are you okay? What happened?" She let out a laugh that sounded more like a sob. I realized I'd been lying to myself for months, maybe longer than that. She wiped at her eyes with the back of her hand. I kept trying to make it work because it seemed like the right thing to do. 3 years, you know? That should mean something. I wanted to get up and hug her, to offer comfort the way friends do, but something kept me in my chair. There was an energy in the room that felt fragile, like moving too quickly might break whatever moment we were having. But it wasn't working, she continued, her voice getting stronger. And I know why now. I've known for a while, but I was too scared to admit it even to myself. She moved closer to where I was sitting, close enough that I could see the exhaustion in her face, but also something else, a kind of determination that reminded me why I'd always admired her strength. "I've been in love with someone else," she said quietly, looking directly into my eyes. "Someone who's been right here the whole time, and I was too much of a coward to do anything about it." My brain seemed to stop working for a moment. The words hung in the air between us, and I wasn't sure if I'd heard them correctly or if my tired mind was playing tricks on me. "What?" I managed to say, though it came out as barely a whisper. She took another step closer, and now she was standing right next to my desk chair. I could smell her perfume mixed with the antiseptic smell, that always clung to her scrubs after a long shift at the hospital. "You," she said simply. "I'm in love with you. I have been for months, and I couldn't keep pretending anymore." The room felt like it was spinning. Everything I thought I knew about our friendship, about her relationship, about the careful distance I'd been maintaining, suddenly shifted. All those moments when I thought I might be imagining something between us. All those times I told myself I was reading too much into a look or a laugh or the way she'd touch my arm when she was making a point. "I don't understand," I said, even though part of me did understand. Part of me had been hoping for this exact moment while simultaneously convincing myself it would never happen. She reached out and touched my face gently, her fingers cool against my skin. "I couldn't go another day without telling you the truth. I couldn't keep living in the same apartment, seeing you every day and pretending I didn't feel this way." Her touch sent electricity through my entire body, and I realized that everything was about to change between us, one way or another. I stared at her, trying to process what she'd just said. The words kept echoing in my head, but they didn't seem real. After 2 years of living together, 2 years of carefully maintaining boundaries and convincing myself that what I felt was one-sided, she was standing in my room telling me she felt the same way. "You're in love with me?" I repeated, needing to hear it again to believe it was actually happening. She nodded, and I could see her hands trembling slightly. "I know this is crazy. I know this changes everything between us, and maybe I'm ruining the best friendship I've ever had, but I couldn't keep it inside anymore." I stood up from my chair, suddenly feeling like I needed to be on the same level as her. "How long have you felt this way?" "Honestly, I think part of me has always known. Even back in college, there were moments when I'd catch myself looking at you differently. But you never seemed interested. And then I met him, and it felt easier to just follow that path instead of risking what we had." She moved to sit on the edge of my bed, and I could see how emotionally drained she was. The hospital shift, the breakup, and now this confession had clearly taken everything out of her. But over the past few months, it got impossible to ignore. She continued. "Every time you'd smile at me, or we'd stay up late talking, or you'd do something sweet like bring me coffee when I was having a bad day, I felt like I was betraying both of you. Him, because I was with him while having feelings for someone else, and you, because I was lying about what I really wanted." I sat down next to her on the bed, careful to leave some space between us. My heart was racing, and I felt like I was in some kind of dream that I might wake up from at any moment. "Last week was the worst," she said, staring down at her hands. "Remember when you helped me move that bookshelf in my room? You were so focused on making sure it was exactly where I wanted it, asking me over and over if the height was right. Such a simple thing, but he never paid attention to details like that. He never really listened when I talked about things that mattered to me. I remembered that day clearly. I'd noticed how she'd watched me work, and there had been this moment when our eyes met and something passed between us. I'd convinced myself I was imagining it. And then you made that joke about how I'd probably change my mind about where I wanted it in a week, and I laughed so hard I almost cried. Not because it was that funny, but because you knew me well enough to predict exactly what I'd do. You've always seen me more clearly than anyone else in my life." She looked up at me then, and I could see tears starting to form in her eyes again. That night, I lay in bed thinking about how wrong everything felt, how I was with someone who didn't really know me, while the person who understood me better than anyone was sleeping in the next room. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. It was the same reason I'd never said anything. Because I was scared. Because what if I was wrong about what I was feeling from you? What if I ruined our friendship? For nothing? This apartment, our easy relationship, the way we can talk about anything, the way you make me feel safe and understood. I couldn't risk losing all of that. I reached out and took her hand, and she looked surprised by the gesture. Her skin was soft and warm, and holding her hand felt both completely natural and incredibly significant. "You weren't wrong," I said quietly. "About what you were feeling. From me, I mean. I've been in love with you too. For a long time." Her eyes widened, and for the first time since she'd walked into my room, she looked genuinely shocked. "Really? Really?" I've been trying to ignore it because I thought you were happy with him. I thought the best thing I could do was be a good friend and keep my feelings to myself. But every day was harder than the last, especially when I could see that you weren't actually happy." She squeezed my hand tighter. "I wasn't happy. I was comfortable, which I thought was the same thing. But it's not, is it?" "No, it's not." We sat in silence for a moment, both of us absorbing what we'd just admitted to each other. The room felt different now, charged with possibilities that had been lurking under the surface for so long. "I keep thinking about all the times we almost said something," she said. "Remember that night 3 months ago when we fell asleep watching that terrible movie? I woke up with my head on your shoulder and you were still asleep and I just wanted to stay there forever. But then I felt guilty and moved away before you woke up. I remembered that night perfectly. I'd actually been awake, enjoying the weight of her head against me, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. When she'd moved away, I'd pretended to be asleep because I didn't want her to feel uncomfortable. I was awake, I admitted. I didn't want you to move." She smiled for the first time since she'd walked into my room, and it transformed her entire face. "We're both idiots, aren't we?" "The biggest idiots," I agreed, and we both started laughing. It felt good to laugh together again, to feel some of the tension leave the room. But then the laughter faded and we were left looking at each other, both aware that we'd crossed a line we couldn't uncross. Everything was different now, and we both knew it. After our laughter died down, the reality of what we'd just confessed to each other started to sink in. We were still holding hands, sitting on my bed like we had hundreds of times before, but everything felt completely different. The air between us was charged with possibility and fear in equal measure. "So what do we do now?" she asked, and I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. It was the same question that was spinning around in my head, but hearing her say it out loud made it feel more real and more terrifying. I looked at our joined hands, thinking about how natural it felt and how long I'd wanted this exact moment. But now that it was here, I found myself scared of what came next. "I don't know," I admitted. "I've imagined this conversation 1,000 times, but I never thought about what would happen after." She nodded, understanding exactly what I meant. "We can't go back to the way things were before. Even if we wanted to, we can't pretend we never said these things to each other." The weight of that truth settled over both of us. Our friendship, the easy relationship we'd built over years, the comfortable routine of living together, all of it had changed in the span of one conversation. There was no way to undo what we'd revealed to each other. "Are you scared?" I asked, because I was terrified and I needed to know if she felt the same way. "Completely," she said without hesitation. "This is the scariest thing I've ever done. What if we try this and it doesn't work out? What if we're better as friends than we would be as anything more? What if I lose you completely?" Those were the exact fears that had kept me from saying anything for so long. The fear that risking everything for love might mean losing the person who mattered most to me. "But what if we don't try?" I asked. "What if we spend the rest of our lives wondering what might have been?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering my question. I could see her thinking, weighing the risks against the possibilities. It was one of the things I'd always loved about her, the way she thought things through carefully instead of just jumping into decisions. My mom always told me that the biggest regrets in life come from chances we don't take, not from chances we do take, she said finally. "But this feels like such a huge chance. It's not just about us anymore. It's about this apartment, our friend group, everything. If this goes wrong, we'd have to figure out how to live together until one of us can afford to move out. How awkward would that be?" I hadn't thought about the practical complications, but she was right. We'd built a life together as friends, and that life would be complicated to untangle if things didn't work out romantically. Our lease wasn't up for another 8 months. Our friends all knew us as the pair who lived together and got along perfectly. Our families had heard stories about each other for years. "Maybe we're overthinking this," I said, though even as I said it, I wasn't sure I believed it. "Maybe we should focus on how we feel instead of all the things that could go wrong." "How do you feel right now?" she asked, turning to face me more directly on the bed. In this moment, what do you want? It was such a simple question, but it felt like the most important question anyone had ever asked me. I looked at her face, really looked at it, taking in the features I'd memorized over years of friendship. The way her eyes crinkled slightly when she smiled, the small scar on her chin from when she fell off her bike as a kid, the way she bit her lip when she was thinking hard about something, like she was doing right now. I want to try, I said, and as soon as the words left my mouth, I knew they were true. I want to see what happens when we stop holding back. I want to find out if what we have as friends can be even better as something more. Relief washed over her face, and I realized she'd been holding her breath waiting for my answer. I want that too, she said. I'm scared, but I want it too. So we're really going to do this? I asked, needing one more confirmation that this wasn't just a late-night conversation we'd regret in the morning. I think we have to, she said. I don't think I can go back to pretending I don't feel this way. And now that I know you feel the same way, I definitely can't pretend. We sat there for another moment, both of us processing the decision we just made. It felt monumental and simple at the same time, like we just decided to climb a mountain together, but also like we just decided to keep walking on a path we were already on. We should probably set some ground rules, she said, and I could see her practical side kicking in. Figure out how to do this without completely disrupting our lives. Like what kind of rules? Like, maybe we take things slow? We've been friends for so long, maybe we need to learn how to be something different gradually. And maybe we don't. Tell people right away until we figure out if this is really working. I nodded, understanding her need for caution. That makes sense. We can just see how it feels, without pressure to define it or announce it to the world. And if it doesn't work out, she said quietly, we promise to try to stay friends. We don't let this ruin what we already have. Deal, I said, though I wondered if that was really possible. Could people go back to being just friends after crossing this line? But looking at her face in the soft light from my desk lamp, seeing the mix of hope and fear and excitement in her eyes, I decided it didn't matter. Whatever happened next, this moment was worth the risk. 6 months later, I was sitting at the same desk where this whole story began, but everything about my life had changed in ways I never could have imagined. The research paper that had been keeping me up that night was long finished and graded. I'd actually gotten an A, though I barely remembered writing it after everything that happened. The apartment looked different now too, in small ways that probably wouldn't be obvious to anyone else but meant everything to us. There were 2 coffee mugs on the kitchen counter every morning instead of 1. Her favorite throw blanket had migrated from her room to the couch we now shared for movie nights. The bathroom had twice as many bottles and products, and I'd learned to navigate around her skincare routine. But the biggest change was in how we moved around each other. Before, we'd been careful to maintain friendly distance, polite boundaries, that we didn't even realize we were creating. Now she'd rest her hand on my shoulder when she passed behind my chair. I'd brush a strand of hair from her face without thinking about it. We'd fall asleep on the couch together watching TV and wake up with her head on my chest or my arm around her waist. The transition hadn't been as awkward as either of us had feared. Maybe because we'd already been so comfortable with each other. As friends, learning to be more than friends felt natural. Like we'd been heading in this direction all along without realizing it. Of course, there had been challenges. The first few weeks were strange, full of moments where we'd catch ourselves and wonder if we were moving too fast or not fast enough. There were conversations about boundaries and expectations that felt awkward at the time, but brought us closer, together. The hardest part had been figuring out how to tell our friends and families. We'd kept our promise to take things slowly and privately at first, but after a month it became impossible to hide. We were too happy, too obviously different around each other. Our friends started asking questions, making jokes about how we acted like a couple even though we insisted we were just roommates. When we finally told them, the reactions were mixed. Some of our friends admitted they'd been wondering when we'd figure it out, saying they'd always sensed something between us. Others worried that we were making a mistake, that we'd ruin a perfectly good friendship by trying to turn it into something it wasn't meant to be. My sister had been the most direct about it when I called to tell her. "Are you sure about this?" she'd asked. Because if it doesn't work out, you're going to lose your best friend and your living situation at the same time. But her mom had been surprisingly supportive when she'd called to share the news. I always wondered about that boy you lived with, her mom had said. You talked about him differently than you talked about your boyfriend. Like he mattered more, somehow. The conversation with her ex had been the most awkward, though it had gone better than expected. He'd admitted that he'd sensed something too, that toward the end of their relationship he'd felt like he was competing with someone for her attention, without knowing who that someone was. Work had been another adjustment. Her co-workers at the hospital had been surprised but supportive, though there had been some teasing about how she'd been living with her future boyfriend all along without realizing it. My classmates and professors didn't really care, but the bookstore where I worked part-time had become more interesting when my co-workers realized my roommate was now my girlfriend. The word girlfriend had taken some getting used to. For the first month we'd fumbled around, not sure how to introduce each other or refer to our relationship. This is my roommate felt wrong now, but this is my girlfriend felt almost too big, too significant. Eventually we'd settled into it, and now it felt as natural as everything else about our relationship. Looking back on that night when she'd walked into my room, I realized how much courage it had taken for her to be so vulnerable. She'd risked everything we had for the possibility of something more, and that bravery had changed both of our lives completely. We'd learned things about each other that we'd never known despite years of friendship. I discovered that she was a morning person who liked to wake up early and make elaborate breakfasts on weekends. She learned that I was much more affectionate than she'd realized, always looking for excuses to hold her hand or put my arm around her. There had been surprises, too. We'd both worried that living together as a couple might feel too intense, too much togetherness. But it turned out that we balanced each other well. When I needed space to work on school projects, she'd give me quiet without making it feel like rejection. When she had stressful days at the hospital, I'd learned to listen without trying to fix everything. The physical side of our relationship had developed naturally too, without the awkwardness we'd both feared. Maybe because we'd already been so emotionally intimate as friends, being physically close felt like a natural extension of what we already had. Our lease was up for renewal next month, and we'd already decided to stay in the same apartment. It felt like home in a way that had nothing to do with the building and everything to do with the life we'd created together within these walls. Sometimes I thought about what would have happened if she hadn't walked into my room that night. If she hadn't found the courage to tell me the truth about her feelings. We probably would have continued being friends, both of us carrying secret feelings and wondering what might have been. Instead, we'd chosen to risk everything for love, and it had turned out to be the best decision either of us had ever made. We'd learned that sometimes the scariest chances are the ones most worth taking, and that the best relationships grow from the strongest friendships. That night had started with me struggling over a research paper, stressed and overwhelmed by the uncertainty of my future. Now, sitting at the same desk with her reading on the couch behind me, the future felt full of possibilities instead of fears. And it all began the moment she decided to be brave enough to tell the truth.